Let's begin with looking at Psalm 19, 7 to 10. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commandments of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. That's what the psalmist writes about law. For many of us, thinking about biblical law, that's not what immediately comes to mind. When we say biblical law, for many of us, our mind goes to the Old Testament and things like capital punishment. And many Christians, including myself at certain points in my life, was embarrassed by what I was reading in the Old Testament. So when you're trying to evangelize and when you're trying to talk about Jesus, you're hoping that conversations don't go into something written in Leviticus, because I didn't know what to do with it. And here I want to talk about the richness, the beauty, the way the psalmist talks about it's sweeter than honey. What is it about biblical law that made David as king say this? We hear Christians say things like, we are New Testament believers. Does that mean that the coming of Jesus annuls all the Old Testament laws? If not, what should we do with Old Testament law? Are Christians expected to obey Jewish ceremonial laws like not eating pork or circumcision? More fundamentally, what is the proper role, status, and significance of biblical law as Christians seeking to engage the public square in our contemporary world? Christians across the board are usually quite familiar with the concept of justice. Many of us are passionate about doing justice. We have some vague idea that it's a good thing, but we lack a rich, biblically grounded understanding of justice. The subject of justice is a popular one in our culture. And there are many different, often conflicting notions of justice. And the question that we have to ask ourselves as Christians is my understanding of justice biblical? And if you ask that question, is my understanding of justice biblical, you have to start engaging with biblical law. And I'd like to tell you why. The Bible has much to say about justice, and the word, of course, is found over 200 times, mishpat, tzedek. And while there are some Christians that have not connected the dots between our personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ and doing the work of justice, there are other Christians who are caught up in the work of justice but don't have a biblical understanding. And I'm trying to address how you can have a biblical understanding of justice and how that understanding of justice is rooted in biblical law. Therefore, a solid biblical understanding of justice is foundational for the engagement that Christians are seeking to have in the public square. We must take biblical law seriously because God cares about justice, especially justice for widows, orphans, and immigrants. When we think about biblical law, as I said before, things like capital punishment come to mind, but there is so much more in biblical law. Let me mention three things as to why we should care about biblical law and how that connects to our faith in Jesus Christ. The first and most important thing to say is that Jesus took the Torah seriously. Let's read Matthew 5:17 to 20. And these are the words of Jesus. Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. And here it points to the climax of history that we read about in Revelation. Verse 17, therefore anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Biting, sobering words from Jesus. So the first thing to say is that Jesus took the Torah seriously. He came to fulfill the Torah. Jesus' own sense of moral vision, his own sense of mission in the world was deeply rooted in the Torah. The second thing to say that connects our Christian faith with biblical law is that if we don't take biblical law seriously and engage with what is in biblical law and the wider story of the nation of Israel, we start creating a culturally manufactured Jesus that fits with our own mores and sentiments that we live with today. So for example, if you're very animated by justice, your Jesus begins to look a lot like Che Guevara, a revolutionary. Or if you are into business and you're into finance, Jesus looks more and more like a businessman. So to overcome these distortions of who Jesus is, we have to go back to seeing what the Old Testament had to say about Israel, and particularly what it had to say in biblical law. And out of that, we get a true and proper understanding of who Jesus is. So the second point I'm making is we cannot truly know who Jesus is if we don't understand the Old Testament, and in particular, biblical law. Finally, I believe that biblical law in the Old Testament spells out, of course, in a culturally specific place and time, what does it mean to love God and love neighbor? So let's go to the words of Jesus in Matthew 22, 36 to 40, and I would like to read a few of these words. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And if you read the Gospels, there are so many questions that people are having about what was given in the Torah. And Jesus, who is the Messiah, they believe that he is the Son of God. But what do you do with all these laws? And Jesus is seeking to explain this. And this is very key for us in these 4 talks. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest command. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. That last line basically sums it up. So these 2 verses are the sort of the headline of what is in biblical law. So if you want to know how to work out these 2 commandments in society, when it comes to finance, when it comes to land management, it has to be in accordance with these 2 commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor. So the point I'm making is that biblical law spells out for us in practical detail, of course, in a culturally specific place and time, what does it mean to love God and love your neighbor in a society that's defined by these 2 commandments. Thank you.